Hey everyone, settle in, dim those screens, maybe fluff a pillow. Tonight's story isn't about battles. Not really. Oh, there will be cannons, but think of them more as punctuation. The real story is about something quieter, and in its own way, far more potent. It's about a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone before him, that reality is negotiable. That history is written not only by the victors, but by the best publicists. So let's drift back, not to a muddy field at Austerlitz, but to a cluttered desk in Paris, where a young general, with more ambition than standing army, picked up a brush and began to paint a legend. Of course he was short. Let's just get that out of the way. The most famous historical footnote of all time. It's irrelevant, but it's everywhere. The truth is, he was average for his time. The real genius was how he took what could have been a subject of mockery, this compact, intense Corsican outsider with an accent, and engineered a physical presence that felt 10 feet tall. He didn't just wear a hat, he created the bicorn, worn sideways like a set of black wings, so that in every painting, every sketch, across every battlefield dispatch, he was instantly, unmistakably the silhouette. He became a logo. Think about that. Before corporations had logos, Napoleon Bonaparte had one. It was a hat. But the hat was just the beginning. This was a man who, upon taking command of the ragged, demoralized army of Italy in 1796, faced a problem. The problem was his officers. Seasoned, grizzled, and thoroughly unimpressed by this 26-year-old upstart who had gotten the job through political connections. His first address to them could have been a plea for unity, a statement of shared purpose. Instead, it was a masterclass in psychological framing. He looked at these proud men and delivered a line so brutally frank it circled back to being inspiring. He said, "Soldiers, you are ill-fed and nearly naked. I am about to lead you into the most fertile plains on earth. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth. No talk of liberty, no lofty ideals of the revolution. Just a simple, transactional promise. You have nothing. Follow me, and you will have everything." He reframed their desperation as potential. He turned their material lack into a burning appetite. He wasn't just a general, he was the guy offering the key to the warehouse. And then, he wrote about it. Obsessively. Napoleon understood the power of the press before it was a cliché. He didn't just send dry military reports back to the government in Paris, which was riddled with his political enemies, by the way. He sent bulletins. And these weren't mere updates, they were short stories, with a very clear protagonist. The Bulletin de la Grande Armée * was less an official dispatch and more the first draft of history, penned by the main character himself. He crafted the narrative in real time. A skirmish became a glorious engagement. A strategic retreat became a masterful repositioning. His mistakes were omitted, or better yet, transformed into the treacherous faults of others. The enemy was always more numerous, the odds always impossible, the victory always a testament to his personal genius and the invincible courage of his men. He was building a myth for consumption at home, a myth that made him indispensable, a myth so potent that the reality of the situation back in Paris, the Directory government was broke, corrupt, and tottering, began to seem irrelevant compared to the epic unfolding in Italy. His greatest early PR stunt, however, wasn't on a battlefield or in a bulletin. It was in a museum. After his Italian campaign, he returned to Paris a hero. The government, wary of his popularity, gave him command of the Army of England, a pointless posting meant to keep him busy and away from politics. Sensing the dead end, Napoleon proposed an alternative, an expedition to Egypt. On the surface, it was a strategic move to cut British trade routes. In reality, it was a multimedia production on an epic scale. He didn't just bring soldiers and cannons. He brought 167 savants, scientists, engineers, historians, artists, botanists. This wasn't an invasion, it was a documentary film shoot. While his army fought Mamluk warriors, his scholars mapped ruins, deciphered hieroglyphs leading to the Rosetta Stone, studied the flora and fauna, and sketched everything in exquisite detail. He staged events specifically for the narrative back home. The Battle of the Pyramids was a real fight, sure, but the name. Pure marketing. The pyramids were barely visible on the horizon. But by naming it after them, he tied his military success to the grandeur of antiquity. He was positioning himself not as a mere general, but as a successor to Alexander the Great. When his fleet was destroyed by Nelson at the Battle of the Nile, stranding his army, he managed the news with cold, brilliant cynicism. He simply didn't tell his troops for weeks. And when the news finally broke, he framed it as a temporary setback, an act of British treachery against the noble cause of bringing enlightenment to the East. The reality was a quagmire of disease, guerrilla attacks, and stagnation. But back in France, through carefully filtered letters and the stunning engravings being prepared by his savants, he was the modern pharaoh, unveiling the mysteries of the Orient. He even faked a betrayal to justify his own abandonment. Eventually, seeing the Egyptian project as a lost cause, Napoleon slipped away in a frigate, leaving his army behind under another general. It was a desperate, arguably disgraceful move. But before he left, he placed a notice in the local newspaper he'd founded in Cairo, announcing his departure for the good of the cause. He created the official record before the act was even complete. By the time he landed in France, the disaster in Egypt was being overshadowed by the sheer, dazzling spectacle of it all. He returned not as the general who lost a fleet and stranded an army, but as the conqueror who had walked in the land of the pharaohs. The first volumes of the Description de l'Egypte, the monumental work of his scholars, were beginning to circulate. They weren't just books, they were proof of his cultural magnificence. So by 1799, when the deeply unpopular Directory was on its last legs, Napoleon's image was untouchable. He was the victorious general, the man of science, the bringer of glory. The political class saw him as a useful tool, a popular figurehead they could control to legitimize a coup. They were, of course, profoundly mistaken. They invited the brand into the boardroom, and the brand promptly took over the company. The coup of 18 Brumaire was itself a fiasco. Napoleon was nearly shouted down and physically attacked in the Council of 500. He panicked. His brother Lucien had to call in the troops. It was messy, clumsy, and fraught with failure. But in the aftermath, how was it spun? As a necessary act to save the Republic from chaos. As the steady hand of the hero of Italy and Egypt restoring order. The narrative absorbed the failure and spat out a foundation myth. He became first consul, then, consul for life. And then, because why not complete the aesthetic, emperor? But even the coronation in 1804 wasn't just a ceremony, it was the ultimate piece of visual propaganda. He didn't have the Pope crown him. He took the crown from the Pope's hands and crowned himself. The message was unequivocal. My authority comes from my own will, my own achievements. No God, no ancient bloodline, just me. David's famous painting of the event is a masterpiece of fiction. Napoleon's mother, who boycotted the ceremony, is prominently placed in the center, looking on adoringly. Even the physical height discrepancy was managed. The steps to the altar were built so that Napoleon, when he turned to face the congregation, would appear taller than the Pope seated behind him. Every detail was a syllable in the story he was telling. And the story worked. It built an empire out of a republic, not just on legal decrees, but on a collective dream he sold with the precision of a master advertiser. He sold glory to the soldiers, order to the bourgeoisie, grandeur to the intellectuals, and to all of them, a sense of being at the center of a new, modern, dazzling chapter in history. He made them feel chosen. He wrapped raw ambition in the packaging of destiny. So as we leave part 1, with the emperor newly crowned, remember this, the throne he sat on was real. But the power that held him there, that was manufactured, carefully, brilliantly, and relentlessly, one bulletin, one painting, one symbolic act at a time. The empire was built. Now came the harder part, maintaining the illusion. But that's a story for when we drift a little deeper. Rest for now. The cannons, as they say, are just warming up. # part 2. The propaganda machine and the perfume of power. So the crown was on his head. A heavy, golden, bees-embroidered thing. The problem with staging your own triumph, of course, is that you then have to live up to it. Every single day. Napoleon, now Emperor of the French, didn't just rule a country, he had to sustain a vibe. The initial, thrilling sales pitch, glory, wealth, destiny, had closed the deal. Now he was in the customer retention phase. And the customer was, well, everyone. His own fickle public, the skeptical old monarchies of Europe watching him like hawks, even posterity itself. He had to make the empire feel eternal, legitimate, and magnificent, all while knowing it was propped up on bayonets and a mountain of debt. The solution, as always, was narrative. But now, the scale had to be imperial. First, he tackled the home front. The French people were tired. The revolution had been a roller coaster of hope, terror, and chaos. What Napoleon offered, and sold masterfully, was not more excitement, but its opposite, boring, predictable, competent administration. He became the CEO of France. He centralized everything, from the tax code to the road systems to the legal system, culminating in the civil code, later the Code Napoleon. This was a genuine achievement, a rationalization of law that swept away feudal clutter. But he didn't just enact it, he branded it. It was presented not as a necessary bureaucratic reform, but as the logical, triumphant culmination of the revolution's ideals. He framed himself as the executor of the people's will, the man who finally made the abstract promises of liberty, fraternity, actually function. He sold stability, and after a decade of guillotines and hyperinflation, stability was a luxury product. But stability is, by nature, unsexy. So he had to keep the dream of glory alive, especially for the military, which was his primary power base. Here, he invented a feedback loop of reward and recognition that was pure genius. The Legion of Honor, established in 1802, was his masterstroke. It bypassed the old aristocracy of birth and created a new aristocracy of merit, or, more accurately, of service to him. A common soldier could, through bravery, earn a shiny piece of metal on a red ribbon. It was a tangible, wearable symbol of the Napoleonic promise. Talent and courage would be rewarded, regardless of where you were born. He turned honor into a commodity, and he was the sole distributor. These awards were handed out in lavish ceremonies, reported in every paper. They created a sense of individual investment in the empire's success. Every man with a medal on his chest became a walking billboard for the system. Then there was the press. He moved from writing the bulletins to controlling the entire narrative ecosystem. He whittled down hundreds of Parisian newspapers to just a handful, all under strict state supervision. The official newspaper, Le Moniteur Universel, became the gospel. Editors received daily directives on what to emphasize and what to ignore. Criticism was not just suppressed, it was made to seem irrelevant, unpatriotic, a failure to appreciate the grandeur of the age. He understood that it wasn't enough to silence opposition, you had to render it invisible within the dazzling spectacle of the empire. And oh, the spectacle! Napoleon's court was not a return to the dusty, powdered wig formality of Versailles. It was a carefully curated performance of modern majesty. He repurposed the old royal palaces, but filled them with a new cast. His marshals, many of whom were former tavern brawlers and sergeants, now dripping in absurdly opulent uniforms. His siblings, installed as kings and queens of conquered territories, playing at royalty like children in a lavish dress-up game. The whole thing had a slight air of insecurity, of new money trying desperately to look old. But it was orchestrated. He instituted strict etiquette, not because he loved bowing and scraping, but because ritual creates legitimacy. It forces people to participate in the fiction, and through participation, they become believers. You might laugh at the newly minted count of such and such behind his back, but if you had to address him as, Your Excellency, and bow, you were, in a small way, reinforcing the entire pyramid that put him there. His marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810 was perhaps his most audacious PR stunt in this phase. After divorcing Josephine, who could not give him an heir, he set his sights on the ultimate symbol of old regime legitimacy, a Habsburg princess. It was a staggering move. This was the family that had ruled the Holy Roman Empire for centuries, the embodiment of everything the revolution had supposedly overthrown. And now, the Corsican upstart was marrying into it. He wasn't just gaining a wife, he was purchasing a bloodline. The message was clear. The new Bonaparte dynasty was now equal to, and blended with, the oldest monarchy in Europe. The old order was not defeating him, it was assimilating. The baby, the King of Rome, was born a year later, a living, breathing argument for the empire's permanence. But let's float over to the artistic wing of the operation, because here, Napoleon was a micromanaging creative director. He enlisted the greatest artists of the day, like Jacques-Louis David and Antoine-Jean Gros, not to paint reality, but to paint theology. These were not portraits, they were icons. In David's Napoleon Crossing the Alps, we see the ultimate piece of branding. The real Napoleon crossed on a sure-footed mule, wrapped in a practical gray cloak, later admitting he'd been freezing and miserable. In the painting, he is a radiant demigod on a rearing, wild-eyed stallion, pointing the way to destiny, his cape billowing in an impossible wind, the very rocks of the mountains bearing the carved names of Hannibal and Charlemagne. He is literally inserting himself into the historical canon. Gros's paintings of the battlefield at Eylau show Napoleon not as a commander, but as a Christ-like figure ministering to the wounded and the dead, his face a mask of tragic compassion. It was a staggering rebrand of war itself, from brutal necessity to a theater of noble sacrifice, with the emperor as its saintly stage manager. This control extended to his own image. He banned unflattering depictions. The official busts and portraits had to follow a template: calm, Roman, imperious, vaguely youthful. The receding hairline, the later paunch, the signs of stress, all airbrushed away by artistic decree. He was creating a visual vocabulary for power that was meant to be timeless. He even tried to dictate fashion, promoting neoclassical styles for women to boost the French textile industry and, of course, to make his court look like a living fresco of a new Roman Empire. Yet, for all this top-down control, the most potent propaganda often came from the bottom up. The soldiers themselves, the Grognards the grumblers, became legendary. Their incredible endurance, their battlefield wit, their fierce loyalty tempered by a willingness to complain about everything, was romanticized and disseminated. They were the human face of the Grande Armée, and their reputed invincibility became a psychological weapon before a single shot was fired. Napoleon, the master of the personal touch, would remember names, ask after a soldier's hometown, and stage these interactions where they would be seen. He was the CEO doing a walkthrough of the factory floor, making every grunt feel seen. It was a cult of personality, but one built on a foundation of genuine, shared hardship and success. So by 1811, the picture was complete. The emperor stood at the center of a self-created universe. The laws bore his name. The newspapers sang his praises. The art deified him. His son had Habsburg blood. His soldiers wore his medals. It was a total environment of Napoleonic reality. The fiction had been made so comprehensive, so immersive, that it became, for millions, simply the truth. The empire wasn't just held together by force, it was glued together by story. But every storyteller knows that the third act is the hardest. And in the distance, beyond the carefully managed borders of his narrative, a chill wind was rising. One that carried the scent of snow, and of a story beginning to spin wildly out of the author's control. But for now, the machine hummed. The legend was in its golden hour. Let's pause here, in the perfumed, gilded air of the Tuileries, before the first crack appears in the canvas. Part 3. The cracks in the canvas. The portrait, by 1812, was pristine. Or at least, every officially sanctioned copy of it was. But if you were to step back from the grand, heroic canvas, you might notice the first, fine hairline fractures. Not in the gilt frame, but in the very composition. Because a story, no matter how well told, eventually has to contend with a stubborn thing called consequence. And Napoleon, the master author, was about to discover that some plot twists are audience-driven. The problem with selling yourself as invincible is that you have to keep winning. Forever. The economy of glory he'd built was inflationary. The public's appetite for victory, fed by a decade of bulletins and paintings, had grown monstrous. A mere win was no longer enough. It had to be decisive, monumental, history-altering. A stalemate was a defeat. A retreat was unthinkable. This created a terrible strategic trap. He could no longer make pragmatic choices. Every decision had to service the myth. And the myth, by 1812, was pointing east. The invasion of Russia was, in many ways, the ultimate PR stunt. It was meant to be the final, definitive chapter that would force his last great rival, Tsar Alexander I, to kneel within the continental system, Napoleon's blockade against British trade. But more than that, it was a narrative necessity. He needed a victory so vast, so crushing, that it would echo through the ages and solidify his dynasty for centuries. He assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, the Grande Armée, over 600,000 strong from across his empire. It was a physical manifestation of his power, a walking, marching advertisement. The plan was simple: force a massive, decisive battle, annihilate the Russian army, and occupy Moscow. The Tsar would have to sue for peace. The world would see. But the Russians, inconveniently, had read his previous campaigns. They refused to play their assigned role in his script. They retreated, drawing him deeper into a vast, empty landscape that became a character in its own right, a silent, draining, existential opponent. There were no grand battles to paint, only endless marches under a punishing sun. The bulletins from this period are fascinating studies in narrative strain. They speak of maneuvers, of strategic advances, of the enemy's cowardice. They do not speak of the growing lines of stragglers, the horses dying of thirst, the resentment.